Welcome to our proceedings. These are slightly less extended participation on this side than you had been billed, because our common colleagues who are going to join us from the Commons Transport Committee have proved unable to do so. Nevertheless, this was our initiative, and I hope you will put up with only having their lordships here today rather than the full array of politicos from this palace. Welcome. This committee is looking essentially at the consequences and options on Brexit for this internal market as a whole, and one of the dimensions of that is the transport system. And we're looking, therefore, at the preparations that industry and government are making for Brexit. What would be the optimum for your operations, and also what you are concerned about. We do know that from the National Audit Office's work that there are 18 work streams which the DfT are working on. We also know that the DfT's technical notes in relation to no deal are imminent. You may have more information than us, but they're not here yet. I was hoping they might be by the time of this meeting, but they're not. Can I just ask you a general question about your view of DfT's work here, both in terms of what they would like out of the Brexit deal and what the situation would be if there were no deal, whether you think the department has identified the right priorities and whether there is some work not completed, and whether your engagement with the Department for Transport and maybe DEXU has been sufficient in this run-up period. In answer to that first question, could you briefly also introduce yourselves, and if there's something you're burning to say early on, get it on the record then, in case our questions don't cover it. So whatever your top lines are, you might start from this opening question. Mr. Braithwaite.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Alan Braithwaite. I've been in the transport and logistics sector for very nearly 40 years. I am the chairman of the Chartered Institute of Logistics Freight and Logistics Policy Forum, and a member of its Public Policies Committee. We've been engaged in extensive discussions over the last nearly 2 years with the Department for Transport, which have widened gradually to include DEXU, Treasury, HMRC, and the Border Force Coordination Group. And we've had 4 round tables with officials from those areas, and that's gradually expanded over those 4 sessions. We're very, very pleased with the engagement we had, and we like to think that we coined the term frictionless. We can't actually prove it, but we'd like to think that. And that's probably our obsession, is creating a frictionless trade process, because that's crucial to business supply chains. So we don't think that some of our concerns around frictionless and labour rights and so on actually fall within the purview of the Department for Transport. So it's a wider cross-cutting issue. And in general, we were very comfortable with the position of the DfT that went into the Chequers paper in terms of the fundamental principles. So we're very supportive of the DfT. We don't think it's all within their purview to grant the things that we're interested in, and we've been very happy to cooperate.
Thank you very much. Mr. Meany.
Thank you. I'm Andrew Meany. I'm a partner at Auxero. We're an economics consultancy, and I head the transport practice there. So we cover all modes of transport across Europe. I've done quite a lot of work on Brexit, particularly in relation to the costs imposed on the haulage industry and ports and supply chains, some of the implications around that. looking really at the costs associated with delays at borders, and also really whether there are alternative solutions, which I think our session is going to come on to. I'd say two things about the work the department is doing. One specific point, it mentions transport infrastructure at borders. I think it's perhaps too late to talk about transport infrastructure at borders now, and we need to be talking about operational solutions that can be implemented between now and the 29th of March next year. The other is not to lose sight of strategic thinking in amongst the specific things that need to be delivered before the 29th of March. So really whatever form of Brexit we get, how do we make sure that we make the most of that, and are we doing as much as we can from a transport perspective in order to achieve as much as we can after March the 29th. Now, some of that's going to come through from industrial strategy work, but I'd want to make sure that there's links between what's happening on Brexit and what's happening under the auspices of the industrial strategy, for example.
All right, thank you. Dr. Niblett.
I'm Matthew Niblett. I'm the Director of the Independent Transport Commission, or the ITC as we're better known. The ITC is a pan-transport research charity which covers also land use. I should say that our principal focus is on personal travel, but we do continue to retain an interest in freight issues and have done occasional work in that area. We are principally engaged with the industry, and on that basis we conducted a consultation last year which was extensive and resulted in a paper which I believe some of you have seen. More recently, I can say in terms of the Department for Transport's work on this area that for those commissioners, ITC commissioners who've been involved with the CILT roundtable sessions, they've noted that they've always been attended by senior departmental officials who have been consistently interested, well-directed and very clear about their preparations. Nonetheless, I think the National Audit Office report made a number of helpful recommendations to enable the department to improve its preparations, and we would expect the department to take those points on board.
Thanks very much. I mean, specifically, the NAO did underline the need for more progress on IT systems, but of course it is somewhat difficult to finalise an IT system until you know quite what the arrangements at the borders and beyond are going to be. But do you feel that the department has made sufficient progress, given the politics are still the final deal are still uncertain?
We've not seen any evidence to the contrary. Our understanding is that the department is working very hard to make sure that these systems will be in place. Though, as you say, in the event of no deal, it's very difficult, even for the department, to predict exactly what the consequences of that will be.
Right. Could I also ask you because Mr. Braithwaite mentioned the term, or claimed ownership of the term frictionless trade. My mantra of this is that any trade short of a customs union is probably not entirely frictionless, and a lot of the focus has been on tariffs, but of course most frontiers and most international trade is subject to a lot of other things apart from the tax. So even let's assume that we get a zero tariff field. The Chequers proposal also refers to rules of origin, which may be more difficult to negotiate, but nevertheless is another. But there are other administrative issues at most frontiers. What could I ask each of you to define what you mean by frictionless trade, and whether you are confident we are going to achieve something like it?
May I? Yeah, the borders are not just about customs and VAT and all that stuff. They're about sanitary measures. They're about health. They're about people. They're about a whole range of things. And the discovery that was revealed to me as part of this working group was just how many different border agencies there are. Now, a major step forward has been the Border Coordination Committee. One of our members is actually under NDAs working on that. But we go back to our original recommendation from 2 years ago after the vote, and we said that with technology it was not beyond the wit of man to anticipate most of the conditions that would be necessary to start to build systems now, and that actually doing that in anticipation would be a powerful negotiating position. So we've seen that progress. What we can't tell is just how well that's being done and how integrated those measures are. I'll give you a little anecdote because it's the one I like particularly. The import of Argentinian beef comes to Rotterdam and is then trucked through Dover. And the reason that was done was that the health inspections that were done at one of the UK ports was somewhat more onerous, and some consignments were rejected, whereas the discovery was that there was a slightly more relaxed atmosphere in Rotterdam. So, and this is how these things work, okay? And that's how an established route of trade. The company's got itself well anchored, and that's how it does business. Now, if we get radical change, if we get disruptive processes with officials at borders, then that is not going to be frictionless, and that's the thing we're concerned about.
Right.
I think it's worth defining frictionless on a number of angles. Although, of course, I'll defer to Mr. Braithwaite. It's not just a UK issue, so the UK can do a lot. Some of you will have heard Secretary of State on the radio this morning saying that UK can do what it can, but what you also need is that each member state where we are putting lorries, putting trains through at that border on a daily basis, they need to act in a particular way to maintain frictionless movement of those goods, whether that's between Northern Ireland and the Republic, between southeast of England and France, other ports of call. So it's something the UK can do something about, but it's then appealing to EU partners in order to make sure that frictionless trade is a daily occurrence after we have left the EU. It's something that's particularly important. So you've got 300 lorries an hour moving through the port of Dover and onto the ferries. I think 9 of those at the moment are subject to checks because it's involving non-EU traffic. There's then a set of decisions to take about to what extent you want to expand those checks, and it's not just at Dover, it's at Holyhead, it's at Cheriton for Eurotunnel. It's also the same at the similar points on the other side of the border. There's decisions to take around regulations. So are the food regulations, the forestry products regulations going to diverge or stay the same? At the moment, when we leave, they're going to stay the same because of the withdrawal legislation that's been put in place already. But if the UK wants to do something different, wants to sign a free trade deal with another country where the regulations are different, then at that point we start to diverge. There's then a choice around the amount of enforcement. So how many of those other 291 lorries an hour are you actually going to stop? And how much is the UK going to stop? And how many are France, the Netherlands, etc. going to stop as well? And if you start to move that dial slightly north of 9, that's where you start to impose costs at the border because lorry drivers are having to be paid for longer hours. There's an inventory cost around the stuff in the back of those lorries hanging around, not getting to that supply chain, whether that's in the UK or overseas. And those costs start to mount up. And of course, as soon as you start checking more lorries, your enforcement increases, then those lorries start to build up, where again, whether that's in Holyhead, whether that's on the M20, somewhere around the UK. So it's these costs associated with enforcement. You start putting a bit of friction into that system, and that system ultimately costs the haulage industry, but it then feeds very quickly through into consumer prices.
Thank you.
I should say I think my colleagues here have defer to their expertise on this area. It wasn't a term that we coined, but our understanding of friction is very much similar.
Okay, Baroness Noakes.
I think you've just asked about systems. So I think that was probably my question, but I wonder if it's worth exploring the Department of Transport's readiness more generally apart from systems. And I wondered if we should test out the views of our witnesses on whether there are areas where the Department of Transport you feel is not making the right preparation. This is going beyond systems, but all the other things that might need to be done. The systems are certainly necessary for the new registration and certification requirements, but there'll be other aspects that need to be looked at.
Let's start there.
The preparations for the Permits and Trailer Registration Act, we're fairly comfortable that is in train, and there's no evidence that they're short of resource, but we can't see the contingency planning, and we can't see any of the scenario preparation around where border inspection points should be. If I can raise the question of authorized economic operators, we think that's incredibly important. At the moment, there are about 600 companies here in the UK compared to 5,000 in Germany. So we're not ready. We've been advocating that our members go up this curve, and there was a meeting yesterday at Cranfield University where a show of hands showed that probably half those attending were now beginning to apply. The point about authorized economic operators is that it's embedded in the Chequers paper as trusted tradership or authorized economic operators, and if you have those people conforming, then you can move your border inspection points to anywhere you particularly choose, and you're intercepting then, if you do need to intercept, a much smaller number of traffic. So we're very concerned that British industry hasn't grasped that this is an essential precondition for frictionless trade, and we have asked the DFT and indeed the other agencies that we're talking to promote this.
In the lead on,
they're not in the lead on that, no.
So they wouldn't be taking the responsibility for delivering that.
So they're not on the lead on the systems, but are they
No,
not
on authorised economic operators, trusted traders.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not totally sure.
It'll be HMRC.
Yeah, it could be. Yes. Okay.
Sorry, just authorised economic operators, the number of companies is significant, but it's also worth bearing in mind the proportion of trade that is comprised by the activities of those companies. Do you have an estimate? Because I understood we're talking about quite a high proportion of trade covered by those 600 companies.
Oh, I don't have that estimate.
We'll pursue that. I thought it was about 70 or 80%. But
yes, our trade, compared to many European countries, our trade in terms of businesses controlling that trade is much more concentrated. That is a fact of life in UK business. Yeah. But nonetheless, my understanding is that if you have a chain of authorised economic operators from both your transport companies, the forwarders, the retailers, the manufacturers, that provides the integrity that would, under an intelligence-led checking process, provide HMRC and the authorities with assurance.
But largely the reason to do it has been to do with the security associated with the products, the transfer of products, hasn't it, up until now, and it's quite a costly process to go through.
Yes.
For the future, of course, more companies would have to do it because it's not just about security, it's about compliance.
Yes.
And they haven't really understood yet, at any stage yet, into what circumstances they're moving that might give rise to the need to pay the cost to become an AEO.
And that's one of the uncertainties which has delayed many businesses from planning.
Supplement to that.
Yeah.
To ask about the AEO process. It's not without its bureaucracy, is it? I mean, apart from having to pay, it's not a short and quick filler double sign as you did.
Well,
before.
I've never applied for it, Lord Gorman, so I can't tell you, but I am told that it is, and there were very high levels. There was 85% rejection last year on the initial applications, so it's not an easy thing to do, and the Institute's tried to offer training and development so that we can help people to self-certify, but the take-up on that has been quite disappointing as well.
Can we be clear that the trusted trader, the AEO status, is one dimension of this, but the European Community Licence, which a rather larger number of British companies hold, is the other dimension of it. And as I understand it, there could be up to 10,000 involved already in that system, which is effectively the access to the totality of the European market through cabotage rights.
Do you thought that the preparations for the Haulage Permits and Trailer Registration Act were
They're proceeding as far as we're concerned as an institute. We believe that that's going in the right direction. I'm not sure.
No, well,
I'm not
querying
tracking with
figures,
you. I apologise. I think you took me out of a place that I thought I was in.
Right, okay. All right, okay. Yeah. I'm clear. The difference between having 600 AEO operators, which
Yes.
are the big companies essentially, and those that have already got a community licence of some sort, which I understand is a much larger figure.
It may well be, but I'm not.
Right, okay.
I'm not aware of that.
Okay. Baroness Anderson.
I wondered, following on from that, the concern really is with the small companies that have not had, that don't currently have the capacity because they've just been trading with other EU nations, so they haven't needed to go through major preparations and so on. And who you said earlier on, Mr. Braithwaite, that the 80% of the people or 50% of the people in the room were preparing, but they were the people in the room. And what I wanted to ask was, do you have specific concerns about the small companies, the small operators, and have you got any idea about how they are being reached in terms of really upskilling them for what they're going to have to deal with?
Well, first, I think you're right. I think that bigger business is going to be faster onto this. Secondly, that the levels of extra bureaucracy, if they are, will impact small businesses disproportionately. I don't have any information on that. One of my colleagues on the Public Policies Committee is also a senior member of the FSB, and I know she's very concerned about the implications for small business in a whole range of scenarios of that sort. So I don't have any specific information in that area.
Okay.
Any further questions from my colleagues on this front? You seem there has been substantial progress. I mean, Baroness Anderson and I have dealt with the road haulage bill, particularly Baroness Anderson, who was on the front bench for it. And at that point, it did appear that the preparations were not very far advanced, but we are 6 months on. And you seem reasonably confident that things have moved significantly.
Well, and we do have a transition period. So we
Yes,
may have a
true,
transition
yeah.
period.
Yes, indeed. Okay. Can we go on to the next area, really, which is relates to the Port of Dover in particular, Lord Chairman?
Could I pick up, Mr. Vini, your comment at right at the outset when you said that there are many operational solutions which we still have waited to see, and can I pick on Operation Brock and the Port of Dover? You might want to consider also other parts of the country. I mean, I know we know what is it, 300 an hour, or what is that, 7,200 a day truck movements through Dover. You've got 2,000 a day Holyhead, 500 from Fishguard. I mean, the list goes on. Do you foresee there being a problem, and what do we know about the situation with Operation Brock, and is there anything more that we think we could press the government to do?
Okay. So for those who are unaware, so you've got the sort of easterly route into Dover on the M2A2. You've got the westerly route, which involves the M20, which goes past Cheriton, the entrance to the Channel Tunnel, and then further round into Dover. Operation Brock is a contraflow system to put onto the M20 on that westerly piece of infrastructure. I'll sort of talk about South East England first, and then maybe sort of make similar comments for elsewhere, because while there is special attention being paid to the M20 solution, as you say, there's an awful lot of this traffic that is performing an important role from an economic perspective, that is also potentially subject to slowdowns and a loss of frictionlessness, if that's a thing. I coined that one. But we need to make sure that there is similar arrangements for these other ports. But going back to Operation Brock, it's a solution that is being consulted on by Highways England in relation to the M20. Their website says that they've received comments. They're then going to put some more detail out in the winter when they're going to consult again on options. This is a largely operational solution to hold traffic on the M20 while still allowing some traffic to move around the lorries that are being held there on the M20. From my perspective, as an economist, what you want to see is that both the Channel Tunnel and the ferries at Dover are both running as full as possible, so that you're not holding stuff on the M20 that could be on a ferry or in a train. So whatever the operational solution is, needs to make sure that you are letting stuff flow, subject to the French borders being open and there aren't lots of checks going on there, but making sure that that's the prime objective, if you like, for whatever the solution is. There's also then some further issues around making sure that whatever infrastructure operational solution you're putting in place is not favouring one operation over the other. You have Dover, it's there further to the east. If you're putting the solution in on the M20, then there's a risk of favouring Eurotunnel, or equally if you're doing something on the M2A2 side, that you're favouring Eurotunnel in terms of just being able to get to one of those two locations as easily as possible. So whatever ends up being put in place, and we don't have much time left, then it needs, I think, to fulfil those two criteria, so that whatever is put in place actually works if you need it to work. If we maintain something similar on the 30th of March, then people are going to be able to turn up and go on the trains and on the ferries. My final remark is, whatever you're putting in place on the M20, you need to make sure that you're able to keep frictionless movement going in and around these other ports as well. Don't spend excessive amounts of time coming up with a solution for the southeast. Make sure you've got solutions in place should you need them for these other ports and locations.
Can I just ask you, the government says that Operation Brock will be in place by the 29th of March, and you just mentioned other places. is it your view that this project will be in place and it can be in place by that time?
I think all we can say is that we know where the project has got to from a Highways England perspective. There's a lot of operational detail that will need to be finalised between now and the 29th of March, let alone putting in the actual contraflow infrastructure, the signage, the training of the people who are going to make this all work and operate. And then you need a substantial information exercise for people both coming in on lorries from Poland, for example, into the UK, and also lorries going out of the UK across that route. So there's a lot of things that need to be put in place before then.
Could I come in on that? Are the comments that you made now with relation to the likelihood of being in place by the 29th of March equally applicable to places like Holyhead? You're obviously aware of the very high volume of traffic through Holyhead, and an area that hasn't in the past had these sort of problems, which Dover has had on occasions. Is this happening?
I'm not aware of a specific scheme to deal with Holyhead. That's probably in the purview of the Welsh Assembly, but I may be wrong.
Lord Rees,
hold on.
Questions here. Sorry.
Can I just on another point that's associated with that? You said that you had to be careful that you didn't differentiate between different modes of transport. Is there likely to be pressure for a differentiation with regards to the goods being carried? For example, if mussels being carried from North Wales to Paris that have to be there in 14 hours, the consignment is useless if there's a delay. There are other things just in time which are very useful for industry, and there are other things that don't actually have a time criteria. Is there any differentiation likely?
I think it's very difficult for, with the volume of traffic that's coming through, for you to say you can go through, you can't go through on the basis of the HGV that's coming through. I don't think there's an operational solution that can distinguish between the value of what's in the back, and so you're applying a blanket solution. Now, what may happen, because logistics is very good at changing the traffic patterns, is that certain types of freight, should it need to, may move to alternative forms of getting the mussels to Paris on time. But there's a good reason why it's going through southeast England at the moment, and that's because even if there's a delay, it's still the quickest way of getting through. And so it would need a fairly major change at that part of the border relative to another part of the border for people to take different decisions.
A few questions over here, Lord Rees.
Just a point of information, are there going to be associated problems and delays on the other end, on the mainland European side of the...
Yes, absolutely.
And what's being done about them?
So we know that this is an issue that's being... the ports in mainland Europe are equally as concerned about. They also faced issues in summer 2015 when there were delays, predominantly or exclusively on the Calais side, so this is why it's important that in order to maintain frictionless trade, you're keeping borders moving freely on the UK side, but also on the mainland European side. And there will be concerns about queues and inability to access markets in the same way that the UK is concerned.
Well, actually, Lord Rees has just about exactly asked my question, but I would add one further point. Do you know, because perhaps I ought to, but I don't, what proportion of lorries going either way across the Channel are actually UK and what proportion are EU registered? Do you know?
I do.
You do. Mr. Braithwaite does.
Yeah, it's at least 80% foreign registered. The samples that we've seen, it can be as high as 90%. The implication of that is that there's between 16 and 20,000 foreign trucks operating in the UK at any one time. That's of the size range, it's around 15 to 20% of the entire UK registered capacity, which is actually operating outside. One of our concerns and expectations is that if there are very significant delays on the short sea crossing, the channel crossing by whatever route, that traffic will switch to unaccompanied modes, either trailer unaccompanied or multimodal containers. We know that there are investments being made in Tilbury in anticipation of that, about 800,000 units, so it's a substantial investment. And we fully expect that to happen because the cost of the driver sitting around has then a huge knock-on implication in that haulage capacity then doesn't exist in the UK. It's a very substantial upgrade on the 40-ton, 44-ton sector. And the other thing to note is that somewhere between 30 and 50% of everything moving through Dover by whatever means is food. It's very significant food. So the food will be perishable. The other operators have much more latitude to switch, and if the delays are unconscionable, they will. Of course, that's then a threat to Dover in terms of its capacity.
Baroness Anderson.
It's a threat to the Channel Tunnel as well.
Yes, sorry, and the Channel Tunnel, correct.
Actually, my question fits in very well with where we are in this discussion, because ABP has argued for the use of other ports, and the statistic you've just given us indicates that actually this isn't an issue by any means of just the capacity of our ports and our roads leading to ports. Is actually the capacity of the roads and the ports surrounding Britain as a whole. Now, has any work been done, to your knowledge, in any way to look at the knock-on impacts within Europe and whether the proposed solutions that we're looking at in Britain are actually realistic from the point of view of hauliers and the authorities in Europe who are going to be dealing with the changed pattern of trade?
Certainly, I'm not aware of any work that's gone on in mainland Europe. Certainly, we're aware that the major ports are gearing up to understand the implications and plan for this, but I couldn't point you to specific studies. There's a couple of points I would make. So one is that the European Commission is doing what it's calling a realignment of its North Sea to the Mediterranean core network. And effectively that's because the UK is part of that corridor that the European Commission is looking at. But effectively what it's saying there is that with, I think, 80% of Irish road freight that ends up in mainland Europe comes through the UK, so down through Holyhead and out down through southeast England. That alternatives are being sought to effectively being checked 4 times, potentially, depending on regulatory divergence enforcement, which I've talked about already. And so there's potential there for these movements to be taken on direct Dublin to or Dunlowry to somewhere, and discussions around, is that France, is that Belgian ports, Dutch ports, etc. So there is this possibility of diversion depending on the extent to which the ports and road infrastructure in the UK is sufficiently well designed and is able to maintain frictionless trade. Clearly, if we maintain frictionless trade, then these efforts are not necessary because things are going as quickly and as cheaply as they can at the moment already. The other thing I'd say about potentially taking trade out of the short route across the Channel, again, it's going that way for a reason. It's the cheapest and quickest way at the moment, and it's supporting supply chains. It's enabling perishables to move quickly. You can put this stuff into other ports, but it is going to be more expensive to the port operators, the hauliers. It's going to be more expensive in terms of the road infrastructure, whether that's in the UK or on mainland Europe, and those costs are going to find their way into the supply chain and into consumers' pockets. And there's also a question about, even if some of this stuff moves, it's because of whatever happens, it's worth this stuff moving. You've still got to deal with the vast majority of stuff going through the tunnel and through Dover. And I think it's really important just to remember that.
Can I just ask you a general question on all of this? Because it partly arises from the preparation of the ports to the other side. Because when Baroness Noakes and I and members of another committee were in Dover, we were told there were reasonably good relations with Calais and Dunkirk, and that they were also beginning, but they would need time. Now, in answer to an earlier question on the permits, I think it was on, you said we've now got the transition period or the implementation period. Does that mean by implication that if there were no deal which incorporated the transition period, there would be a bigger problem than if, in effect, the changeover takes place at the end of 2020?
If there was any sort of hard stop, it would be horrible. I went to a very interesting meeting last week at the London Business School, and Linda Yeo, who's advising the Treasury, spoke, and I don't think I'm revealing any confidence when she said 3 scenarios: the good, the bad, the ugly. The good is some sort of facilitated trade agreement, the bad is WTO, and the ugly is some sort of horrible space in the middle. And that's what you get, and then there'd be all sorts of interesting behaviours.
Would be horrible.
I think uncertainty breeds behaviours, breeds enforcement of regulation, breeds stuff happening on the ground, breeds delays. That's how I see it. That's what happens in the real world.
Yeah, so there's a no deal creates a set of choices on the UK side to let stuff move through at the current rate of enforcement and checking. You're then asking each member state to apply on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis the same principle. And as we know, it doesn't take much much grit to put a lot of friction into these processes.
This is supposed to be a multimodal discussion, so can we move briefly on to the other modes, maritime and ports? Baroness Donaghy.
Thank you, Chair. Obviously there are immediate concerns about UK maritime sector relating to customs and capacity, but what opportunities and challenges does Brexit present for the maritime sector in the medium and long term? And also, what kind of a relationship should the UK seek to have with the European Maritime Safety Agency? Do any existing third country arrangements provide a useful precedent?
Is that yours, Dr. Nivette?
I can begin if you like. In terms of the opportunities that exist, I think it's difficult until the final trade package has been determined to predict with any certainty what the impacts are going to be. But we do need to remember that the UK's maritime sector is structurally different from ports on the continent. Our ports are less regulated, they're privately financed. And so I think much will depend on the ability of the UK government to deregulate where appropriate and resist the temptation to introduce regulations that prevent ports from operating as efficiently as possible. From the contributions that we've had to our consultation have suggested that the long-term structural differences could release our own port owners to be very responsive to supply chain changes, and that could become more influential unless there's an expected move by the EU to reduce regulation across the continent. Of course, new trade routes also could help to certain ports, which at the moment, say on the west coast or on the northeast coast of the UK, which may at the moment not be operating to their full potential.
Anybody else want to come in on that?
Yeah. Auxerro worked on a project for the Department for Transport at the time of the Maritime Growth Study, which was something that was going on sort of late 2015 time. I think despite the elapsed time since then, a lot of the issues that arose then, but also the opportunities that we identified and the Maritime Growth Study identified are still relevant. I think it's somewhat of a maybe call it a Cinderella sector, in that there's a internationally important cluster on the maritime side in London, which is fed by the UK's ports and shipping companies around the coast and indeed through international markets, and that is something that's perhaps less well known about, and also there's a lot of opportunities created from an employment perspective through some of the training packages that are supported for people to become seafarers, and then over time sort of feed this, whether it's ports and shipping around the country or indeed this cluster over a long time. So that and also with Brexit, none of that really goes away. You've still got the IMO based in London. So there are, I think, fairly similar opportunities to what we saw 3 years ago. These are around making sure that there's an attractive fiscal environment, an attractive regulatory environment, and also that perhaps Cinderella is taken to the ball here in terms of actually promoting the sector, whether that's from a government perspective or an industry perspective, so that this is seen as an attractive working environment and somewhere to develop skills as an alternative to perhaps a normal route, whether that's an apprenticeship or through a degree course. So I think there's some really interesting things to look at there from the work that went into the Maritime Growth Study that should make sure that we're looking at the long term for the maritime sector.
I think the WTO scenario actually presents a significant opportunity, because I think supply chains will switch source, and there will also be an opportunity to straighten out what's called the Rotterdam effect. I don't know if you're familiar with that. House of Commons Library estimates it's about 5%. The work that we've done suggests it could easily be 10 to 15%. So there's an uptick in container volume from non-EU sources, which is potentially available. The other thing we'd like to see considered is the introduction of free ports and those sorts of zones as a business opportunity in a deregulated world, and we would not, as the CILT, want to see adherence to the European Union port regulations, because our structure is so different, as already been observed.
Can I just ask you about the European Maritime Safety Agency? What kind of relationship should the UK seek for the future?
I can't answer that question.
I would suggest, we need to remember the European Maritime Safety Agency was established after the sinking of the Erika, and it's really helped to improve both sort of safety across the continent, as well as preventing polluting ships from environmental damage. I think the intention at the moment is to maintain current EU regulations on this point through the withdrawal bill, and that's a sensible outcome, since it will provide the least disruption to commercial and operational concerns, And assuming that there is a transition period, that will also include the preservation of existing EU agency membership, which again is welcome for the same reason of continued stability.
I mean, the port sector has railed against some of the EU regulations, and they're mostly privately owned ports, and, which is distinct from the European situation. And I can see that greater freedom may well help with some diversion of global trade, but for those operators who are simply plying across the Channel or North Sea, there has to be some congruence of regulation at both ends of that chain, doesn't there? So there will have to be some degree of recognition that there are parallel, if not completely identical, forms of regulation of that trade.
By and large, we would advocate regulatory alliance in most cases, but our port structure is internal to how we operate in the ports. Doesn't mitigate against safety, does it?
No, sure. Yes, it's not to say it.
Yeah.
Yes. Andrew.
Sorry, just to be clear on that latter point. So, I mean, there are third country arrangements with the European Maritime Safety Agency in any case, aren't there? Because in order to comply with EU regulations for shipping using EU ports. But the Port Services Regulation is not about the ships visiting the European Union, it's about how we manage the structure of governance of British ports. That's where the divergence might lie. Okay, so it doesn't impact on trade as such. No, okay. That's correct. Could I turn, if I may, to rail?
Indeed,
I think just over the course of the last few weeks there's been some coverage of Network Rail talking about the cost benefits that might accrue to them of divergence from some of the EU rail regulations. So we might seek a bit more information from the rail-related bodies about that. But I just wondered, from your point of view, is that likely to impact adversely on any aspect of our practical trade with the EU, or is it purely a governance issue? And in any case, should our objective be alignment? Should we have a common rule book on rail regulation with the EU, or should we be thinking about trying to shift to an international rail set of standards, since such to some extent exist?
Okay. Perhaps if I can start. So I think it's important to distinguish between interoperability. Does your signalling system on your train work on one side of the channel and then still work on the other side? And then, but perhaps we'll come on to this, some of the market regulation elements in terms of should you be vertically separated, integrated, etc. But dealing with the first of those, clearly where we have train routes traversing the borders, then I think there's pretty limited scope for differences in standards. So that's primarily around HS1 Channel Tunnel, but also the line from Belfast to Dublin, which we shouldn't forget. I think what you want to make sure is that to the extent you're talking about the Mid-Wales line, for example, it's fine if you might want to change technical standards relative to those that prevail in mainland Europe. If we're just talking about something that's very specific to that geographical location, what you don't want to do is to start moving things like signalling standards away, where actually all that does is create a difficulty from buying from the global market, because whatever the widget is you need to buy, you suddenly need to make changes to that in order to apply it to the UK. Now, I'm sure Network Rail are thinking about this as part of what they're doing, and they're only going to diverge away from the European technical standards where it's going to be beneficial and it's not creating a small market where the UK ends up paying more.
But have you, from your knowledge of these things, did you regard Network Rail's comment as something which the rail industry would be likely to embrace and say, well, this is going to reduce cost and that's going to be of benefit to us, and we can't see any prejudice to safety or interoperability?
I think you only need interoperability where things need to interoperate. I think what the industry will be looking for from Network Rail and standard setters in the industry is to think through all of the costs and benefits, and where divergence is worth doing, then by all means to do that. But making sure that some of these unintended consequences that I've mentioned don't emerge.
Anybody else on the? Sorry.
If I may add there, I mean, it's also worth mentioning that any form of sort of transition to new interoperability standards will be complicated, because railway projects always have a very long lead time, and existing projects will also have incorporated the application of these TSIs, as they're called. As Andrew's mentioned, I mean, there are considerations on both sides. I mean, presumably Network Rail may be thinking about examples where very strict compliance with these standards has led to increased costs, such as the electrification of the line between Glasgow and Edinburgh, where apparently a derogation was needed but not obtained. There may also be scope for saving some costs on projects, but any legislation will need to be amended to establish a process for this without creating substantially more processes and bodies than exist at the moment. On the other side of the equation, we need to remember, and this was a point emphasised by a number of respondees to our consultation, that as a result of these developments and their adoption by manufacturers, the UK has widened the market for products incorporating these standards around the world. And if British manufacturers cease to build to the TSIs outlined by the EU, then the international market for our products could be smaller by excluding the EU and other markets. We also need to remember, I think, that the UK industry has been very active in the development of the EU TSIs, and so any exclusion from the standards development process will affect individual careers, organisations, but also remove our influence on how those develop.
Is the implication of what you say that in general the European TSIs are also global, or virtually?
They will have an impact. They'll be taken into account in the process of determining those, because it's such an enormous market.
Right. Okay. Another dimension of the rail, Lord Aberdare.
Thank you. This goes to the other dimension of the EU railway packages, the governance and market pillar, and whether you see any case for UK divergence from that, whether we could look at moving away from the one-size-fits-all approach and maybe even considering the possibility of companies owning both track and trains, and having a more diverse marketplace and ownership structure. Any thoughts on that issue?
Yeah, maybe I can take this first. So I think there are opportunities to investigate changes. What's happened over time is that there was privatisation in Britain, separation between track ticket retailing, train operations, and also rolling stock ownership. Largely speaking, European legislation, we were consistent with European legislation at the time, but European legislation has followed that path through. Similar to other infrastructure sectors, really looking for parts of the value chain that can be opened up to competition, with a view that opening up to competition, whether that's for the market, so rail franchising, or in the market, as in rail freight operations, is something that is generally seen as a good thing. If you're taking the opportunity of no longer being in the EU to reassess this, then I think what we'd say is make sure you know what you want. What are your objectives before making any change? That will include minor changes to the status quo or more significant changes to common ownership of track and train and train operations potentially. So one of the things to look out for is under that common ownership is typically you will always have long distance services, whether those are passenger services, freight services, and you want to make sure that whoever's owning the bit of railway over here and is having someone transitioning that bit of railway, you want to make sure they're doing that on equal terms. We have very strong rail regulation, strong competition law in this country that can facilitate that non-discriminatory behaviour. Some of the other things that you would need to consider, does the new arrangement that you're looking at, does it make things better for the passenger and the freight customer? That's probably the main priority. Does it make it easier to fund or finance the infrastructure? And also, what does it do about the balance of risk? So we've seen the Transport Committee talking about the East Coast franchise this week and talking about how a bid took on a lot of risk, and the department's review of that bid was not necessarily looking at all of the stress tests that it could have done. To the extent that is an issue under rail franchising, if you add the infrastructure into that business, you're not taking away that revenue risk and you're adding cost risk. So you need to make sure that the market is going to want the structure that you're creating. That may require less risk transfer in terms of the revenue side, while opening up the opportunity for different models. There's one final point that's very important, which is what Network Rail has at the moment is a portfolio of assets. When we've seen whether it's a seawall in Dawlish or between Dover and Folkestone, or the track collapsing in Cumbria, landslides between Banbury and Leamington. Network Rail has a portfolio. It manages those risks as a portfolio and is able to draw in money from other parts of the network in order to fix these things in an emergency. The more you sort of regionalise things, then the more that your budget for a particular area becomes exposed to these major infrastructure risks that become quite difficult to manage. And certainly in a sort of British Rail era, typically if something like that happened, it was just left. It wasn't repaired, fundamentally because the funding was not there in order to put the services back into place. But going back to my original point is, yes, there are a range of different things you might be able to do from a market design, market structure perspective, but let's make sure we understand what we're trying to achieve before we reach for one of these.
One of the criteria you mentioned there was passenger service. We haven't heard much about passengers, and maybe Dr. Niblett would like to comment on that as well. But because, I mean, I also wonder about, we talked about Project Brock for lorries, but I mean, we're going to need a Project Brock for passengers as well, lining up on the M20, waiting for their turn. But say, could you say something about?
I think it's worth in that respect mentioning that the UK already has one of the most liberalised rail markets in Europe, and since we've been operating a vertically separated and regulated railway after the 1993 Railways Act, we've seen massive growth in passenger numbers on the railway. We at the ITC are publishing some research later this year which will look at the factors that have been driving that growth and whether or not they are intrinsic or extrinsic to the rail industry. But it's likely that increased passenger choice has obviously had a number of benefits and likely to have had a positive impact upon rail passenger growth. Your question about divergence from the governance and market pillar, what does that mean for passengers? I mean, I think we would agree with Andrew that government will need to have very detailed advice, analysis and consultation before embarking on very radical reform to the existing arrangements. We also noted that the Chequers White Paper suggested that international operations through the Channel Tunnel will need to be based on bilateral agreements. And given the very high proportion of journeys that currently happen between London and Paris by rail rather than air, we need to be aware that any change to that position would have very significant impacts upon passenger fares, as well as environmental impacts from having to use other modes. We haven't talked much about the impact upon personal checks. I gather that a new paper was produced today by the government on passports and what that might mean. I have to confess I haven't looked at that yet, but we'd be very interested to explore that further to see what the implications might be for passenger movements.
Okay, thank you. If I could just, I'm not a rail expert, but I took some advice from colleagues, and one of the concerns with sort of re-verticalisation, if that's the correct expression, of the railways would be that rail freight might lose out to powerful passenger interests, and we have a particular passion for trying to increase the volume of goods moved by rail freight, because that has a whole range of societal and environmental benefits. So we see a sort of strategic threat there from the sort of organisational consequences of as it were, compartmentalising. Other than that, I agree with everything that Matthew and Andrew said.
Right. We're coming towards the end of our time now. Can we go back to the road and look at driving licences for all drivers, really? Jenny Ann Branderson.
Thank you. Well, I think it's worth talking about it in two respects. One is driver licensing in relation to haulage, but also for ordinary motorists. And there was information in the news today, you may have noticed, about would we or wouldn't we need an international driving licence. And it'd be interesting to hear from the government's papers published today what their view is and what they're planning. Going back to 2014, the review of the balance of competences felt that the EU had overreached itself in its prescription in regulations on driver licensing and testing, and yet road safety experts cite the importance of being able to rely on high standards. Do you agree with, which of those two views do you agree with? And if we become a third country, does the EU have any agreements with third countries on driver licensing and testing? For example, an awful lot of EU drivers must drive through Switzerland, and do they have agreements there?
No one
wants to answer that one.
I don't think there are any restrictions to driving through Switzerland. You have to buy a carnet to move through, but that's a road permit. I think the Institute did respond to the balance of competences consultation in 2014, and I was able to find it, which I was rather pleased about. And by and large, we say we benefited from alignment. I just take you back to the number of foreign trucks operating here, and there are safety concerns with that, but that's a question of training and competence elsewhere. So there's a real dilemma, because that takes capacity out if we chose to do something, and would increase friction. So that's a bit of a horny one, isn't it?
I think we need to remember that the purpose of this legislation was to improve harmonisation of movements across the whole continent, and in so doing we've benefited from increased efficiency of those movements, but also from improved safety in other European countries where their standards have been pulled up by the EU's regulation on this issue. So we feel that clearly the existence of an EU licence has been beneficial to us and has helped to improve safety and the efficiency of travel. Any divergence will obviously put that recognition at risk, and in the case of Switzerland we need to remember that although they're not an EEA member, they do harmonise their legislation on this issue totally with the EU, so we would probably have to do the same if we were to enjoy the same level of integration on licensing.
Thank you.
So, I mean, in practical terms, you're saying that a reasonably common system of licensing is actually helpful, even though there might be individual criticisms about how it's enforced or the specifics of it. Okay. Is there any further questions from any of my colleagues on any of the modes we've covered today? I'll ask you again about the expectations from the Department for Transport's preparations for a no deal. In other words, things that come into play in 6 months' time, as distinct from some of these which will require a bit longer. But what are you expecting from the Department for Transport in their technical notes on this? It will be helpful for us to know because we'll be looking out for them. So if you've got any reply to that, but also anything you want to add yourselves before we conclude this session. Perhaps I could take Mr. Braithwaite first again.
I'm waiting with rapt attention for the the technical notes, because it'll tell us where our messages have landed and where they haven't. But clearly, much of what you've covered today is we're going to be informed by where they've landed on it. All I can repeat is their position paper that they shared with us in July, which went into checkers, was utterly reasonable. So
Checkers is seeking a deal. I'm saying these technical notes are supposed to address the situation where we haven't got a deal.
So, I mean, from my perspective on no deal, I'm not. I'm not going to try and predict what the department's doing or what it's about to release, but I think just remembering that costs that are imposed on the transport system in the context of no deal find their way pretty quickly into the pockets of consumers, and that is something that we need to bear in mind. This stuff is moving for a reason. It's because people want to buy and sell it, and doing that at more cost means that generally there's going to be economic consequences.
Indeed, I would second that, and I think we also need to remember that in terms of contingency planning, some of these issues are not wholly in the gift of the Department for Transport, but will also be dependent on decisions made elsewhere. So we would encourage robust interdepartmental consultation and planning on these issues as soon as possible.
And overseas as well.
Indeed,
the UK government can do what it can, but we need reciprocity to deal with these issues.
Right. Okay, any other issues? Or anything you think we should pay attention to as these in the coming weeks? Sorry.
Nothing further.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much for this session. You will be aware that we will produce a transcript which you can check and correct. If there's anything that occurs to you or any developments you think we should be aware of in the next few weeks, we're very open to further written evidence, in particular, I would say, in reaction to anything that jumps out of the page at you from the DFT's technical notes, which we expect very shortly. So thank you very much indeed. That's helped us in our deliberations. It's clear that the relationship with the Department of Transport is quite good. So long may it be that way, but it does require others also to play their part. So thank you very much indeed.
and I don't think I need to detain my colleagues either. We've dealt with a private business, so I'll declare the meeting closed unless anybody puts their hand up very quickly. Okay, in that case, we'll say goodbye to you, and thank you very much to committee members, and I'll see you in about 3 weeks' time, because we have a holiday for 3 weeks.